Hey there, I'm your host, the Bread Pirate. Let's talk about dungeons, shall we? If you've played The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, then you probably can agree with this statement. Divine Beasts and Shrines were fun, but I hope the sequel has traditional Zelda dungeons. Now, that's not true for everybody, but it is true for the majority. Not to mention, this is a topic that a lot of Zelda YouTubers have already covered. Just to name a few, there's Zeltic, The Commonwealth Realm, Game Maker's Toolkit, Hyrule Gamer, Monster Maze, Game Over Jesse, Nintendo Land, Xenogamer, Andre's Restart, Annoying Bogoblin, Zelda Dungeons, Crimcat, HMK, and now us. But this video is different. There's no point for me to rehash what everyone else has already said. Yes, of course, we want themed dungeons, the return of old items, more enemies, mini-bosses, and compasses. Yet today, we're talking about something that no one else has talked about. We're talking about connectedness between dungeons and the overworld in the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Oh, and by the way, remember, I respond to every comment, so if you have anything you want to discuss, let me know. So what is connectedness? Well, simply put, it's the connection between the overworld and dungeons. In a way, it's the link between the two. Oh, no, not that link. Yes, that link. For instance, is there a single entrance and exit, or are there multiple ways of entering? And do elements of the overworld have a place in dungeons? Most Zelda games in recent years have had very little of this connectedness between the overworld and dungeons. Not to mention, in most cases, dungeons are treated as isolated locations with a single entrance, so the dungeons just don't feel like they're a part of the world. I read a review recently about Breath of the Wild, which was back from when it first came out. There was a specific part of the review, though, that caught my attention. It went a little bit like this. One of my favorite additions to the game is the shrines. Glowing caverns scattered liberally across the map. Each one is like a miniature, self-contained Zelda dungeon. The Verge. Well, I see what they're saying, but I have to admit, I'm disappointed when I hear the phrase, self-contained. When I think about a Zelda game, I think about a connected world where dungeons and overworld blend together, and where it becomes hard to distinguish them from each other. And that's because of a certain NES game called The Legend of Zelda. You might not think about it, but the original Legend of Zelda did a lot of things to make dungeons feel like a part of the open world experience. In levels 3, 4, 6, and 8, you can find an old man who will give you hints, but the hints aren't about the dungeon you are in, they're about secrets in the overworld. Think about that, isn't that weird? Why is he giving you hints about the overworld if you find him inside of the dungeon? He should be giving you hints about how to complete the dungeon, right? Well, no, because the overworld and the dungeon are a part of the same world. So when the old man is giving you hints about the overworld, it's because Nintendo sees dungeons as an extension of the overworld. They're not separate locations or worlds. Instead, they're connected. Then there are the items you can collect in dungeons. Usually, they're designed to help you with the dungeon you are in. But there are two items which don't fit into that equation. They are the flute and the raft. Despite being found inside of dungeons, these two items are mainly used for traveling in the overworld. The flute helps you teleport between dungeon entrances, while the raft is used to help you access hidden areas on the map. Going to the flip side, overworld elements often blend into dungeon elements. For instance, the fact that you can find shops and NPCs inside of dungeons is one of these things. In Breath of the Wild, there were the champions who guided you through divine beasts, but for the most part, divine beasts and shrines were lonely and devoid of life. And this came as a huge surprise to me, considering how many treasure hunters you meet on the roads. You would expect to find at least a treasure hunter inside of one of the dungeons or ruins, right? The other thing which blurred the line in the NES game were the keys that you could buy in shops. Instead of being self-contained puzzles, the dungeons could be explored using keys that you had bought from overworld merchants. It gave the player a lot more freedom, and it made the world feel more connected. To be honest, I'd really love to see the mechanic come back. So, as you can probably see, it's a two-way system. The dungeons are accepting things that the overworld normally has, and the overworld is accepting things that the dungeons normally have. It's a beautiful system that was perfectly balanced to make the whole world, dungeons included, feel like a part of the open world. So the challenge for Nintendo in the sequel to Breath of the Wild is finding a way to make dungeons a part of the open air experience. In Breath of the Wild, the dungeon that handled this system of blending best was Hyrule Castle. It's a structure which can be approached from any angle you want, and you'll often have NPCs ask you to fetch things which are inside of the castle. That's why it fits better into the game than the shrines or the divine beasts. It's because it's a part of the open world instead of being self-contained. My other suggestion for the sequel would be to include mini dungeons that have multiple entrances and exits. They could be sprawling mine shafts that dig under mountains, or dense forests that turn into mazes of trees. They could be pathways for travelers, or hunting grounds for treasure seekers. I want to find items in dungeons that help me explore the overworld, and I want to be able to prepare for dungeons by finding overworld items that will make my adventure easier. So, in conclusion, yes, we want traditional Zelda dungeons to return in the sequel to Breath of the Wild, and we want to see dungeons which feature more exploration. But as for myself, more importantly than anything, I want to see dungeons which aren't self-contained. Until I see you next time, have fun storming the castle.